Last Seam, West Virginia, November 1931. He woke before the alarm. He always had, even in the years when the alarm still mattered. When missing it meant losing a day's pay. When a day's pay meant the difference between meat on the table and nothing at all. The alarm clock sat on the nightstand beside the bed, a squat tin thing with 2 bells on top that his wife had bought at the 5 and dime store in Williamson the year they were married. That was 1898. The clock still ran. He had replaced the mainspring twice. Everything else about it was original, the same as it had been when she brought it home wrapped in newspaper. Pleased with herself in the quiet way she had been pleased about small practical things. Walter Cain lay on his back and looked at the ceiling. It was dark outside. Through the single window of the bedroom, he could see the faint gray that came before dawn, the kind of gray that was not yet light, but was no longer pure night. He had learned to read that gray the way some men read clocks. He knew from it that it was about 20 minutes before 5 in the morning. He did not move immediately. He lay there with his hands at his sides, feeling the mattress beneath him. The familiar depression in the center, where 30 years of sleeping had compressed the stuffing into something like packed earth. He had slept in this bed every night of his married life, except for the 3 months in 1917, when he had gone to work the mines in Kentucky, and the 2 weeks in 1924, when he had been in the hospital in Matewan after the roof fall that broke his collarbone and 3 ribs on the right side. His body knew the contours of this mattress, the way his hands knew the handle of a pick. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the hollow. Then silence. The trees were bare. It was the first week of November, and the leaves had been down for 2 weeks, and the hills that rose on either side of the hollow looked scraped and dark against the pale sky. He knew this without looking. He had watched those hills every morning from this window for 31 years. He sat up slowly. His back tightened as he did. A deep pulling along the left side that had been there since the spring, not sharp, not injury, just the constant low complaint of a body that had spent its working life bent at the waist in spaces too small for it. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with his hands on his knees. The room was cold. He had let the stove go down overnight. Coal was not something he had ever been free with, even living as he did 30 yards from the tipple. Some things you kept careful habits about regardless of what surrounded you. That was how his father had been, and his father's father, and he had learned it young and had never unlearned it. He dressed in the dark, not from habit alone, but because there was no need for light. He knew where everything was. His work clothes hung on the nail beside the door, the heavy canvas trousers, the flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had lost all color and become something between gray and tan, the wool undershirt beneath. He pulled them on in order, sitting on the edge of the bed to pull on his boots, lacing them slowly because his fingers were stiff in the cold and did not move well until they had been warmed by use. On the kitchen table, he had left his bucket from the night before. He always packed it the evening before a shift. It was one of the practices he had kept all his working life, because a man who packed his bucket in the morning was a man running behind from the start. Inside the bucket was his lunch: 2 biscuits from yesterday's baking, a piece of cold salt pork, and a jar with the lid tightened down that held cold coffee. It was the same lunch he had carried for 30 years, more or less. Some mornings there was a boiled egg. Some mornings there was not. Today there was not. He stood in the kitchen and ate a small breakfast standing at the counter. A piece of cornbread left from the previous evening, dry, crumbled into a tin cup with a little water because there was no milk. He ate it looking at nothing in particular. The kitchen was small. It had a table with 3 chairs, a cast iron stove, a counter along one wall, and a single shelf above the counter where a few tins were kept. There was a calendar on the wall from the company store, 1931, the year printed large at the top, and below it the months in smaller type. November, the 7th. He had circled the date some time back, not with ink, but with the blunt end of a pencil lightly, so that the circle was barely visible in the morning dimness. He did not need to see it. He had known the date for 6 weeks, ever since the notice had gone up at the lamp house. November 7th, 1931. Last shift. Mine closing effective November 8th. By order of the Consolidated Coal and Coke Company. He rinsed the tin cup in the basin, dried it on his trouser leg, and set it back on the shelf. He took his coat from the hook by the door. It was a heavy canvas coat lined with wool, the elbows worn through, and patched with a different canvas that did not quite match in color. He put it on, then his cap, a miner's cap, flat-brimmed, dark, with years of coal dust that no washing ever fully removed. He picked up his bucket. He opened the door. The air outside was cold and still. His breath came out white in front of him. The sky had moved from gray to a pale blue-gray that promised dawn without delivering it yet, and the hills on either side of the hollow were dark shapes against it, the bare trees along the ridgeline making a jagged line like the teeth of a crosscut saw. He went down the porch steps and onto the dirt path that ran alongside the company row. The houses here were identical 4-room frame houses built by the company in 1899, painted once and not again, the paint long since gone to gray and peel. He had lived in number 7 for 31 years. Before him, another man had lived in it. Before that man, another. They were not houses that men owned. They were houses that men occupied for as long as they worked the mine. And when the mine closed, the company would either sell them or knock them down. And the men who had lived in them would carry their things to wherever they were going next. He did not know where he was going next. He had not let himself think about it with any precision. He had $53 in a coffee tin behind the loose board in the kitchen floor, and he had a brother in Ohio who had written once about work at a rubber plant in Akron, and he had nothing else. No savings beyond the $53. No property. No trade except mining. He was 58 years old, and his back hurt every morning, and his hands were the color and texture of old harness leather. and he had spent 35 years in the mines, not counting the years as a boy when he had sorted coal at the tipple for 20 cents a day. He walked past the other houses in the row. Most were dark. A few had lights in the windows, the yellow flicker of kerosene lamps, because the company had cut the power to the row 3 weeks ago as part of the closure preparations. He could hear from one house a baby crying, and from another the sound of a door being opened and then shut. Further along, a man was walking ahead of him on the path, recognizable by his shape and the particular way he carried his lunch bucket, swinging it slightly at each step. That was Pete Dillard, who lived in number 3. They had worked together for 14 years. Walter did not call to him. Pete did not look back. They walked toward the mine in the pre-dawn dark, with 30 yards of path between them, each carrying his bucket, each inside his own silence. The lamp house was a low concrete block building beside the main portal, its single bare bulb the only electric light still burning on the property, because the lamps required charging, and the charger required current, and the foreman had kept it running for this last shift. The light from the lamp house fell out through its open door in a yellow rectangle onto the muddy ground. Walter stepped inside. The room smelled of carbide and metal, and the particular dusty electrical smell of the charging racks. The lamps were hanging on their numbered hooks. The cap lamps with their small round reflectors, and the coiled cord that ran down to the battery pack you clipped to your belt. His lamp was number 19. He had used number 19 for 11 years, since Haskell Broom had left the mine to go work for his wife's brother in Charleston, and his lamp number had come available. And Walter had requested it for no reason, except that 19 had been his father's lamp number at the mine in McDowell County, where Walter had first gone underground at the age of 14. He unhooked the lamp, checked the battery by switching it on briefly. The light came on bright and clean, which meant the charge was good, and switched it off again. He clipped the battery to his belt and settled the lamp onto his cap, adjusting the bracket that held it until it sat right. The lamp house was empty except for him and the charging racks. And in the corner, a younger man named Curry, who worked the far section, and whom Walter knew only by sight. Curry was 19 or 20, with a broad, flat face and light-colored eyes, and he was sitting on the bench along the wall, lacing his boots, with the focused attention of someone doing a thing that required all his concentration. He did not look up when Walter came in. Walter signed the board, his name, his number, the time, 5:12, and went back outside. There were 11 men on the last shift. He knew this because the foreman, a man named Garrett, had told them at the previous shift. 11 men, 1 shift, and then it was done. Of the 11, Walter knew most by name and had known several for decades. There was Pete Dillard, who was 51, and had a bad leg from a mine accident in 28, but who could still work. There was Owen Hicks, who was younger, maybe 42, 43, and who had a wife and 4 children in the house at the end of the row. There was Buddy Ferris, who was Pete's cousin and who was always talking, always with something to say, though this morning he was quiet. There was the young man, Curry, from the lamp house, and there were others whose faces Walter knew without their names coming readily. The faces of men you work beside without ever quite knowing. The particular anonymous intimacy of men who share labor, but not conversation. They gathered by the portal in the gray light. 8 or 9 of them. The others still coming down the path in 1s and 2s. They stood and did not talk much. A few smoked. The cigarette smoke rose straight up in the still air. The portal behind them was a square black mouth cut into the hillside, framed in timber that had been there since 1901, and which showed it, the wood gray and cracked, the grain raised by decades of wet and dry, the bolt heads rusted to the color of old blood. Garrett came out of the foreman's shack at 6 minutes past 5. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a clean-shaved face and the kind of eyes that were always doing arithmetic. He had been foreman here for 8 years. He walked along the gathered men without greeting them particularly, just looking at who was there, counting. 11, Garrett said, mostly to himself. He looked at his watch. All right, he said. Let's go in. The cage was a steel platform with a steel cage around it, 6 feet by 6 feet, that ran on a wire rope down the main shaft. It held 6 men, so they went in 2 loads. Walter went in the first load, with Pete and Owen Hicks, and 2 men whose names he didn't know well, and young Curry, who had finished his boots and was standing straight now with his lamp on his cap and his bucket in his hand, looking at the shaft with an expression that was not quite fear, and not quite anything else Walter had a name for. Walter had ridden this cage down and up every working day for 31 years. He had long since stopped feeling anything particular about it. The cage shook when it moved, and the wire rope made a particular sound that he had learned to read the way you learn to read the sounds of any machine you depend on. Not the sound itself, but the variations from the sound, the note that meant something was different. Today the sound was the same as always. The groan of the sheave wheel at the top of the shaft, the creak of the wire, the rush of cool air as the cage descended. The walls of the shaft passing in the dark on all sides. He held the rail and looked at nothing. The light from his lamp bounced off the wet rock walls. The temperature dropped as they went down. By the time the cage reached the bottom level, 240 feet, the air was the temperature. It always was underground, 52 degrees year-round, cool and damp, and carrying the particular smell that Walter had breathed for 35 years, coal dust and wet rock, and the faint sharpness of blasting powder and something else, something he had never found a word for, a smell that was simply underground, simply the inside of the earth. The cage stopped. The gate opened. They stepped out. The main entry was timbered and high enough to stand in 6 feet in the center, lower at the sides. The track ran down the middle of it, the steel rails worn bright on top and rusty on the sides, and the timbers that held the roof were black with years of coal dust and grease, and the slow accumulation of everything the mine produced that wasn't coal. The ground was wet. Water came out of the walls. and ran in a shallow stream along the gutter beside the track, cold and black with dissolved minerals, and it ran out to the sump at the bottom of the shaft, where the pump took it out again. The pump had been running for 30 years. Tomorrow, they would shut it off, and in 6 months, the mine would be full of water from the bottom up, and in a year or 2 years, you would not be able to enter it at all. He stood for a moment at the bottom of the shaft after the others had started walking, and let his eyes adjust to the dark. This was a habit from early in his time underground before the electric lamps, when all you had was the carbide lamp on your cap, and the shadows were different, and you needed your eyes to be ready. The habit had no practical purpose now, but he had kept it. He stood and breathed the underground air, and looked down the entry toward the distant lights of the other men's lamps bobbing as they walked. Then he walked too. The main entry was 400 yards long before it branched into the section he worked. The left section, the last seam they had been pulling coal from before the order came down to close. He walked it alone, behind the others, his lamp throwing its circle of light on the ground ahead of him. The sounds of his boots on the wet rock, the only sound after the other men's footsteps had faded ahead. On either side, in the low side entries, he could see the old worked-out sections, rooms that had been mined out in the 1910s and early 1920s, their roofs supported by coal pillars left standing, the dark air in them still and old and smelling of time. He had worked in some of those rooms when he was young. He knew them the way you know places you spent your youth, not with affection exactly, but with a deep bodily familiarity, a knowledge held in the feet and in the shoulders. The left section entry ran another 200 yards before it reached the working face. The ceiling here was lower, 4 feet in places, and he walked with his neck bent and his shoulders rounded in the posture that was so natural to him now that he sometimes caught himself doing it outside, standing in line at the company store with his head tipped forward and his spine curved as though there were a roof 3 feet above him. The seam here was 31 inches thick. He had worked seams as thin as 22 and as thick as 48. 31 was not comfortable. You could not kneel upright in 31 inches. You could not sit upright. You worked lying on your side or crouching with your head bent at an angle that put a specific kind of strain on the neck and left shoulder. But it was not the worst he had worked. The coal was good, hard and bright and clean breaking, the kind that pulled well from the face and loaded easily. It was bituminous, like all the coal in this part of West Virginia, the kind that burned hot and long, and had built the railroads and the steel mills, and everything else that had been built in the previous 50 years. He passed the junction where Owen Hicks and one of the other men turned off toward their rooms, and continued to the end of the entry where his working area was the last room on the left, a space roughly 20 feet wide and 12 feet deep, cut into the coal face over the past several months as they had worked the seam toward its eastern limit. The eastern limit was here now. He had reached it 2 weeks ago when his pick had gone through the coal face and struck the rock beyond, the hard gray sandstone that lay on the other side of the seam, and which meant there was no more coal in this direction. That was when he had known, with his body before he knew it in his mind, that the seam was finished. He set his bucket down against the rib and looked at the face. The coal was black in his lamplight, with a faint bluish sheen where the cleat ran, the natural fracture lines in the coal that ran roughly perpendicular to each other, and that determined how the coal broke. You always worked the cleats. 35 years had made the reading of cleats as automatic as breathing. He looked at the face and saw where the coal would come and where it would not, the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood and sees the grain before he picks up the saw. There was maybe 6 or 7 tons left in this room that could be economically extracted, coal that was accessible from the current position without major undercutting or roof work. The company had not asked him to get it all. The foreman had said on the previous shift, "Just work what's there, fill what cars you can, and leave the rest." The company had been writing off this section for months. Today was not about coal. Today was about finishing. He picked up his pick from where he had left it on the last shift, the handle worn smooth and dark with years of grip, the head dressed to a good edge the previous morning on the whetstone he kept at home. He lay down on his left side in front of the face, adjusted the lamp on his cap, and took the pick in both hands. He struck the coal. The sound was familiar, the dense, particular crack of steel on bituminous coal, not quite like rock, and not quite like wood, something in between, something entirely itself. The coal fractured along the cleat, and a piece the size of a man's hand fell free. He knocked it aside with the back of the pick and struck again. The work of mining coal by hand in a thin seam was this. You lay on your side or crouched at an angle the human body was not designed for, and you swung a pick into a coal face that was inches from your face. And the coal came off in pieces, some large, some small, some powder. And you loaded it into a car or shoveled it into a pile to be loaded. And you did this for 8 hours. And at the end of 8 hours, you had produced somewhere between 1 and 3 tons of coal, depending on the seam and the man and the day. And you were paid by the ton at whatever rate the company had set, which in 1930, one in this part of West Virginia, was 42 cents per ton if you were on tonnage, which Walter was, and had always been. He had not done the arithmetic on what today's tonnage would come to in dollars, because there was no real point in it. 6 or 7 tons at 42 cents was $2.52 or 63 cents, and he knew already that he would not see all of it. There was the powder charge he would be docked for the blasting, the sharpening of his tools docked against his pay, the lamp rental, which had been a point of contention with the company for as long as anyone could remember, and which remained on the books at 10 cents a shift, regardless of whether the law required it. He would see perhaps $2, maybe $2.25 if he loaded more than he expected, $2.25. Last day's pay, he worked without hurrying. Hurrying accomplished nothing in a thin seam, it only tired you faster and made your work less careful. And careless work in a mine was the way men got hurt. He had seen men hurt. He had seen men killed. He did not think about this while he worked, because thinking about it was not useful. But he had carried it in his body for 35 years, the knowledge of what the mine could do. And it had shaped the way he moved, carefully, deliberately, with a respect for the material and the space that was not fear, but was something close to fear's most practical cousin. He worked the bottom of the face first, cutting the undercut, a horizontal cut about 6 inches deep along the bottom of the coal face, using the pick held flat, a motion that required him to keep his elbow near the floor and his wrist cocked at an angle that, on cold mornings, sent a burning sensation up to his shoulder. The undercut freed the coal to break downward when he worked from above. Without it, the coal came off in small pieces, and the work took twice as long and produced half as much. He had been working for 2 hours when he stopped to rest, not from exhaustion, but from the knowledge, accumulated over decades, that a man who did not stop to rest lost more at the end of a shift than he gained in the middle. He sat back against the rib, the coal wall on the side of the room, and opened his bucket. He drank the cold coffee first. It was bitter, and had been bitter since his wife stopped putting chicory in it, which was the way she had always made it, the way her mother had made it. And he had asked her once why she added chicory, and she had said her mother told her it stretched the coffee, made a pound go further, and he had said that made sense. After she died, he had tried to make it the same way, but he couldn't remember the proportion, and so it came out wrong, either too bitter or not bitter enough. And eventually, he had stopped trying and just made coffee plain, which was fine. It was fine. He was past the age of needing things to be a particular way. He ate one of the biscuits slowly. It was dry. He had not had baking powder for a week and had been using soda, which was not the same, and the biscuits came out dense and flat, and did not have the flavor he associated with biscuits made correctly. But they were filling, and filling was the point. The mine was quiet around him. He could hear from a distance the sound of other men working, the faint rhythmic crack of a pick against coal, the scrape of a shovel on the floor. But these sounds were absorbed by the rock and the coal and the damp air before they traveled far. And what reached him was only a suggestion of sound, like hearing music from the next room through a closed door. He sat and breathed and looked at the coal face. He had looked at a lot of coal faces in 35 years. They were all the same and all different. The seam ran through the hill at a slight angle, dipping to the east, and the coal in the face showed its layers. The bright, hard coal at the bottom, where the heat and pressure had been greatest over millions of years. The slightly softer coal in the middle, the thin band of shale that ran through the upper third, and which always gave you trouble because the shale came off with the coal and had to be sorted out and reduced your tonnage. He knew this face the way he knew his own hands. He thought about the first mine he had worked in. He was 14, and his father had taken him to the mouth of the slope entry at 4 in the morning, and handed him a carbide lamp and said, "You keep close to me, and you watch what I do, and you don't touch anything unless I tell you to." His father was a big man, bigger than Walter had grown to be, with shoulders that filled the entry and hands that could hold a full dinner bucket in one hand without effort. He had died in 1911 in a roof fall in McDowell County, in a room not unlike this one, when Walter was 28 and already working for himself. The mine company had sent a letter. They had not sent anything else. Walter had not thought about his father in some time. He found that as he got older, he thought about him more, not less, or perhaps not thought so much as felt. There were moments in the mine when he was aware of his father as a kind of presence, not supernatural, not anything like that, but simply the physical awareness that the same motion of the arm, the same angle of the pick, the same reading of the cleat in the coal face had been his father's motion and angle and reading 30 years earlier, that there was an unbroken line between them in this, that they had inhabited the same posture, breathed the same kind of air, swung the same weight in the same dark. It was not comfort, exactly. It was simply a recognition. The work continued regardless of who was doing it. The coal did not change. The seam did not change. The body that bent to reach it changed and was replaced by another body. And in the bending, they were the same. He thought about his son. Roy was 31 and lived in Cincinnati. He worked at a machine shop there, had for 8 years. He was good with machines, always had been, could fix anything mechanical with an intuition that Walter had never had. Roy had come home for Christmas the previous year, and they had sat at the kitchen table and talked, or tried to, across a distance that was not distance in miles. Roy was a different kind of man than Walter. He lived in a city and had opinions about things Walter didn't follow: politics, the radio, a kind of music called jazz that Roy listened to on a record player he had bought secondhand. They had been careful with each other over Christmas. They had been kind, but there was something between them that was not unkindness. Only the simple fact that they had grown to be men in different worlds, and the world Roy had grown into was further from this mine, further from this hollow, than Cincinnati was in miles. He heard Pete Dillard before he saw him, the particular uneven footstep, the slightly dragged left foot that Pete had had since the accident in 28, when the shuttle car had rolled over his ankle, and the bones had healed crooked. Pete came around the corner of the entry, with his lamp lighting his face from below, which made him look hollowed out, and strange the way all faces look strange when the only light is coming from below. "You eating?" Pete said, just finishing. Pete sat down on the other side of the entry with his back against the rib. He was a lean man, always had been, the kind who stayed thin no matter what. You could see the tendons in his neck and his wrists when he moved. He opened his bucket and took out a piece of bread and a small tin of something that he opened with a folding can opener he kept in his pocket. "Sardines," Pete said, in the tone of a man who knows the answer before the question. Always sardines. Mabel's idea of a joke. He meant his wife. 23 years I've told her I don't like sardines. She keeps packing them. He ate one anyway, holding it by the tail over the tin. Maybe she thinks I'll change my mind one of these days. Walter ate the second biscuit. You hear anything from the company, Pete said. About what? About the men from the far section. Garrett was saying maybe they move some of them to the operation over in Logan County. I heard that. You put in for it. No. Pete looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment. You got something else lined up, he said. No. You thinking about the rubber plants in Ohio? My brother-in-law's been working at one in Akron for 2 years. Says it's steady work. I might look into it. Pete nodded slowly and ate another sardine. 58's not old, he said. No, Walter said. It's not. Neither of them said anything for a while. From down the entry came the distant sound of a pick working coal, rhythmic and steady, unchanged. 31 years, Pete said. He wasn't asking. He knew 31. Pete ate another sardine and looked at the tin. I started in 09, he said. I'll be 40 in February. I've been here since I was 18. He paused. Don't feel like much to say about it. You'd think it would feel like more. No, Walter said. I don't think it would. In the early afternoon, he drilled the shot holes. This was the work that required the most care, not because it was difficult, but because the placement of the holes determined how the coal broke, and whether the break was clean and productive or ragged and wasteful. A well-drilled, well-loaded shot brought coal down in large pieces that loaded easily and weighed well at the tipple. A poorly placed shot shattered the coal to powder and dust, and half of it couldn't be loaded, and the rest measured short. He used the hand auger, turning it slowly. The company had had a compressed air drill here before, but it had been removed 3 months ago along with most of the other equipment that could be transferred to a working operation. He turned the auger steadily, feeling for the grain of the coal, and bored 2 holes at angles that he had been calculating in his head for the past hour. He knew this seam. He knew how it would break. He bored the holes to the depth his arm could reach and withdrew the auger and blew out the cuttings with a rubber tube. Powder was black powder, the same as it had always been in this operation. Not dynamite, not the newer explosives, just black powder in paper cartridges that you had to handle with the particular respect that black powder required, which was different from the respect you gave other things, because black powder was slower to go, but more unpredictable about what would set it. And a man who was careless with black powder was a man who took risks he had no business taking. He loaded the shots carefully. He had loaded shots for 30 years. His hands did it correctly without his needing to direct them, which was the right way. The thinking part had already been done in the planning of the holes, and now it was execution. He set the fuse with the care he had always given it, not the hurried care of a man getting through a task, but the steady, deliberate care of a man who had watched other men take shortcuts and had watched what came of it. He lit the fuse and walked to the entry and stood behind the corner of the rib, counting. The shot went with a flat, hard crack that he felt in his chest more than heard. The dust came out of the room in a brief wave, coal dust and rock dust and powder smoke, and he waited the required time before going back in. This was one of the few rules he had never broken in 35 years. The waiting time after a shot. The shot had broken well. A face of coal, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, had come down from the face and lay in a pile on the floor. Some of it in large pieces, some medium, some fine. He looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who has anticipated a thing correctly, and found his anticipation confirmed not pride, not pleasure exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of craft, the feeling that comes from knowing your material and being proven right by it. He began to load. The car was an old wooden mine car on steel wheels, dented and black with long use, with a capacity of about 1.25 tons. He loaded with a short-handled shovel, working from the outside of the pile inward, the large pieces first because they went faster, and the small pieces second because they filled the spaces. He loaded low and even, not piling high, because a high-loaded car could shed coal on the trip out and lose you weight at the tipple. He worked for 2 hours loading, stopping once to rest, and once to re-wet the handkerchief he wore over his nose and mouth when he was loading in heavy dust. The dust was thick after the shot. It always was. He had breathed coal dust for 35 years, and he knew, because he had watched other men, what it did over time, the shortening of breath, the cough that started gray and went deeper, the thing they called black lung, though it had other names in other places. He was not there yet. His breath was still good enough, his chest still clear when he woke in the morning. But he knew it was in him, some portion of it, the accumulated dust of 35 years laid down in the tissue like a debt that had not yet come due. He did not think about this with any great feeling. It was simply a fact. You breathed the dust, and the dust did what it did, and you lived as long as you lived. And the arithmetic of it was not something you could change by knowing it. By mid-afternoon, the work slowed, not because he had run out of coal, there was more at the face, but because he had loaded what was economical, and was now in the part of the seam where the coal was thinner and harder to work, the eastern limit where the seam thinned against the sandstone. The coal pinching down to 15 or 18 inches in places, and becoming mixed with shale, and having the bad cleavage that thin seam coal always had, the kind that shattered small and loaded heavy and paid poorly at the tipple. He sat for a while in the quiet. The mine had a particular quality of silence that was unlike any other silence. Above ground, silence was never complete. There was always wind or birds, or the distant sound of something mechanical, or simply the sound of air moving through leaves or grass or whatever was there. Underground, the silence was complete. When the mine was not working, it was absolutely quiet, in the way a sealed room is quiet, in the way the interior of stone is quiet. The only sounds were the ones you made yourself, your breathing, your boots on the floor, the small sounds of settling timber and dripping water that were the mine's own breathing. He was aware of the weight above him. 240 feet of rock and soil and tree roots, and the surface of the world pressing down through the coal pillars and the timbers that held the roof. He had been aware of it for 35 years, and he was still aware of it, not with fear, the fear had gone in the first years, but with a steady, deep consciousness of it, the way you are conscious of your own heartbeat when you pay attention to it. It was not oppressive. It was simply present. He put his hand flat against the coal rib and held it there. The coal was cool and slightly damp and utterly hard under his palm. He could feel nothing through it, but he left his hand there for a moment before he picked up the shovel again. He thought about Roy again. It came back underground the way thoughts did when there was nothing but the work and the dark and the quiet to hold them. Roy had been 12 the last time Walter had taken him underground. It was 1922, and the mine had had an open day, a company thing. Men could bring their families in to see the operation, and Roy had been there. He remembered the boy's face when the cage reached the bottom, the eyes wide not with fear, but with something like wonder, that specific wonder of a young person confronting a physical reality that is nothing like anything they had imagined. The underground was not like anything above. It was another world, literally, another set of relationships governing light and sound and space. Roy had been quiet the whole time he was underground. He had asked one question: "How do you know which way is up?" Walter had said, "You always know." "Your body knows." Roy had thought about this and said, "But how?" And Walter had said, "It's like asking how you know which way is down when you're standing in a field. You just know. You don't have to think about it." Roy had nodded slowly, but Walter could see he wasn't satisfied. Roy was a boy who needed to understand the mechanism of things, who needed to know not just that something worked, but how and why it worked. This had made him good with machines. It had also made him sometimes drive his father to impatience, because Walter was not a man who thought about mechanisms. He thought about materials, about what things were, not about what made them that way. The difference had never been resolved between them. It had only been outgrown on one side and accepted on the other. He wondered if Roy thought about him, not with sentiment, not asking whether Roy loved him, because he knew Roy did in the straightforward way children love parents, which is a thing that does not require examination. But whether Roy thought about this, about the mine, about the life his father had led, as anything other than something distant and past, whether it occurred to Roy today of all days that his father was underground right now, 240 feet below the surface of West Virginia, on the last day of the only work he had ever done, he thought probably it did not. Roy was in Cincinnati with his own work and his own life. This was as it should be. This was what you raised children for, so they could have their own concerns, their own direction, their own distance from the thing you were. His wife's name had been Edna. She had been born Edna Hatfield and had become Edna Cain when she married him in 1898, when they were both 25 and young in ways that he could now barely remember, the particular young of people who have not yet had anything taken from them. She had died in 1919, in the October of the flu year, one of the 40 million or however many millions the sickness took, and she had died in the bed in the front room of number 7 because the hospital in Williamson was full, and there was no room and the doctor who came said there was nothing to be done in a hospital that couldn't be done at home, which he said to everyone because he was overwhelmed, and perhaps also because it was true. She had been sick for 8 days. He had not gone to the mine for those 8 days. He had done what could be done, which was to keep her warm and keep water in her and tell Roy, who was 9, to stay with the neighbors down the row. The doctor had come twice. After the second time, he had not come again. She had not been afraid. This was what he remembered most clearly, not the specific things she had said or the specific things she had done, but the quality of her, which was that she was not afraid of it. She was weaker each day, and she knew what was happening, and she did not fight it in a way that made it worse. He had sat beside the bed and held her hand, and she had looked at the ceiling with the particular distant look that very sick people have, the look of a person listening to something the others in the room cannot hear. And once she had said, "Make sure Roy's coat is mended before winter. The left elbow is going through." And he had said yes, he would. And she had said good. He had mended the coat himself badly, with a piece of different colored wool that didn't match. Roy had worn it anyway the whole winter, without saying anything about it. He had not remarried. People had suggested it over the years. His mother-in-law once, obliquely, and Pete Dillard's wife directly, naming a widow who lived in town. But the thought of it had never taken hold in him. He had gotten used to the shape of his life without Edna in it, which was a process that had taken a long time, and was not the same thing as not missing her, but which had settled eventually into something he could carry without it stopping him. He had kept her clock on the nightstand. He had kept her habit of circling dates on the calendar. He had done these things without thinking much about them. At 3 o'clock, he heard the change, the distant sounds of other men stopping work, the air different in the entry, the particular quality of the mine when it was winding down rather than working. He had one more carload partly loaded, and he worked steadily to finish it, keeping his rhythm even, not rushing, not slowing. The shovel moved. The car filled. He loaded the last piece, a large chunk, the size of a man's head, that had been sitting on top of the pile since the afternoon shot, and pushed the car to the junction point where the trip rope could take it out to the main entry. He came back and looked at the room. He had worked this room for 4 months. He had come into it in July, when it was new cut, and the coal face was still tight, and the roof was fresh, and the timbers were new wood. He had worked it through August and September and October, and into November, eating his lunch against the same rib, setting his bucket on the same ledge, laying his pick against the same corner of the face while he loaded. He had breathed its air and sweated in it, and sat in its quiet during rest and heard, from it, the sounds of the mine on all the days of the summer and fall. The room was not much to look at. It was a hole in a coal seam, 4 feet high at the highest point, and lower at the edges where the seam thinned, 20 feet wide and 12 feet deep, timbered with 6 sets of props and crossbars, the floor covered with coal dust and broken shale, and the marks of months of work. The face was ragged where the afternoon's shot had opened it. The coal that remained in the face would stay there now. It would stay there until the water came in, when the pump was shut off, and then the water would cover it, and eventually the roof would come down, and the timbers would rot, and the room would collapse and fill. And in 100 years or 200 years, there would be no sign that it had existed, that a man had spent 4 months of his life in it, that any of this had happened at all. He picked up his bucket. He picked up his pick. He did not think of anything particular in that last moment. He was not a sentimental man, and he had not been preparing words for this occasion, not even in the privacy of his own mind. He had been underground on hundreds of last days, the last day of a room, the last day of a section, the last day of a shift before vacation or illness or whatever kept you out. And none of them had required any particular ceremony. A room was a room. You worked it until it was worked out, or until you were told to stop, and then you stopped, and you moved to the next one. This was the first time there was no next one. But even that was not something that required ceremony. It was just what it was. He swung the pick one more time, not hard, just a single controlled swing, enough to chip a piece from the face, a small piece, the size of his fist, that fell to the floor at his feet. He picked it up and looked at it in his lamplight. It was bright coal, the good hard bituminous of this seam, and it caught his light and reflected it back in the particular way that fresh broken coal does, before the oxidation sets in and the surface dulls to gray. The broken face of it was almost blue in places, almost beautiful. He turned it in his hand, then he put it in his coat pocket. He was not entirely sure why. He did not usually take things from mines. He had not done it before, that he could recall. But the piece was there, and he had looked at it. And then it was in his pocket. And that was all the reason there was. He picked up his bucket and his pick, and he walked out of the room for the last time without looking back. The walk back to the shaft was the same walk in reverse. 200 yards through the section entry, another 400 through the main entry, past the old worked-out rooms with their dark air and their silence, past the sump where the pump still chugged its steady rhythm, unchanged. He walked alone. The other men were ahead of him or behind, and he could hear them, but not see them in the dark. The sounds of footsteps, and the occasional low voice carrying in the rock, and then gone. The main entry felt different going out than going in. Going in the morning, it was a passage into the day's work. Each step was a step toward what you were going to do, and the direction of it had meaning. Going out, it was a passage back to the surface, which was the same thing it had always been, but which felt different today. He tried to name the feeling and could not exactly. It was not grief. It was not relief, though there might have been a small, thin thread of relief in it somewhere deep. It was something more neutral than either of those, something that had to do with completion, with the end of a thing that had structured all the other things. He passed the place where the main entry was lowest, a section of about 20 feet where the roof dipped, and a man of Walter's height had to bend almost double to get through. He had hated this section for 31 years. It gave him trouble every morning and every evening, an indignity at the end of the day, when your back was already tired, a cramping and bending that pulled the already pulled muscles in new directions. He went through it for the last time without ceremony, without any particular awareness of it, which was perhaps the most honest way to go through it. Ahead, he could see the glow of other lamps at the shaft bottom, the gathering of men waiting for the cage. He recognized shapes: Pete's lean silhouette, Owen Hicks's broad shoulders, Buddy Ferris with his hands in his pockets. Young Curry stood slightly apart from the others, his lamp bright, his hands at his sides. The pump's sound filled the shaft bottom, its rhythm steady and patient and unchanged. The sound that had been the underground's heartbeat for 30 years and would stop tomorrow and not start again. The first cage load went up without him. He waited with the second group, Pete, Curry, and 2 others. They did not talk much. There was nothing to say that had not already been said, or that was worth saying in this moment with the shaft at their backs and the mine all around them. Pete stood with his lunch bucket and his pick and looked at the cage gate. Curry stood with his hands at his sides and looked at nothing particular. Walter stood and felt the cool air rising from the lowest parts of the mine, where the water was already standing in the places the pump couldn't reach. The cage came back down. The gate opened. They got in. He held the rail. The cage rose. Around him, the rock walls moved downward, which was the same as moving upward. But in the cage, you were stationary, and the world moved past you. And there was always this brief confusion between the two, the mind insisting on one reality while the eyes reported another. The temperature rose as they ascended, degree by degree, the 52-degree underground air becoming 55, then 60, then warmer as they came toward the surface. He could smell the change before he felt it, the underground smell thinning, giving way to outside air, cold and carrying the faint smell of dried leaves and something mineral, the November smell of West Virginia that he had breathed every day of his life. Going up this shaft, the cage slowed. It stopped. The gate opened. Light, gray November light, which was not bright, but was immeasurably brighter than the lamplit dark below, came in around the edges of the cage door, and his eyes contracted against it. The same contraction they always made, though after all these years, they adjusted faster than they once had. He stepped out onto the surface of the earth. The air hit him, cold, 50 degrees or less, with a thin wind out of the northwest that cut through his coat where it was worn thin at the chest. After the constant 52 degrees of the mine, the outside air always felt colder than it was, at least for the first minutes. He stood at the portal and breathed. The sky was overcast, a flat gray without sun, the kind of sky that promised nothing in either direction, that held November light in it without releasing it. The hills around the hollow were dark with bare trees, their ridgelines sharp against the pale sky. Below, in the hollow, the company rows of houses were visible. The gray-brown buildings, the dirt paths between them, the outhouses and garden patches, and coal sheds, everything in the spare, used, careful look of a mining community in the long, slow depths of the depression. He looked at all of it without expression. There was smoke from a few chimneys, the women who had stoves still going, warming the houses for the men coming off shift. He could see, from here, the window of number 7 dark. He had no one at home keeping a fire for him. The other men were coming out of the portal behind him and dispersing, walking down toward the lamp house to turn in their lamps, walking toward the rows, some standing in small groups talking. He heard Buddy Ferris's voice, too loud as always, saying something about Logan County, about the operation there, about whether there was real work or just rumors. He heard Pete say something brief in response. He did not listen to the content of it. He stood at the portal for another moment. He was aware of the ground under his feet, the compacted earth of the mine yard, the same earth he had stood on thousands of times. He was aware of the sky. He was aware of the piece of coal in his coat pocket. A small, steady weight against his hip. He walked to the lamp house and unhooked his battery from his belt. Inside, the room was the same as it had been that morning. The racks, the smell of carbide and metal, the single bulb. He removed his lamp from his cap and hung it on hook number 19. He recorded the return on the board, his name, his number, the time. 4:47 p.m. The lamp house clerk, a young man named Eddie who worked at the company office and who had been assigned to the lamp house for the shutdown, took the board and looked at it. He was 22 or 23, smooth-faced, with clean hands. He stamped something on a form and tore off a slip of paper and handed it to Walter. "Pay voucher," Eddie said. "Company stores open tomorrow morning. You can redeem it then." After that, he paused, uncertain about the after that. After that, I think it goes to the main office in Williamson. Walter looked at the slip. $2.18. "Thank you," he said. He folded the slip and put it in his shirt pocket and went back outside. The other men were still there in ones and twos, still talking, dispersing slowly in the way men do when they don't want to quite admit that what is happening is what is happening. He watched Garrett come out of the foreman's shack with a padlock in his hand. He watched Garrett walk to the lamp house door and clip the padlock through the hasp and push it shut with a sound that was not loud, but that carried in the cold air across the yard. The lamp house was locked. The charging racks would run until the batteries ran down, and then they would stop. Tomorrow, someone from the company would come with a truck for the equipment. Walter watched Garrett do this without any feeling about it that he could name. Then he turned and walked toward the rows. The path from the mine yard to the company rows was 60 yards, gravel on the mine end and mud on the house end, worn into 2 parallel tracks by 30 years of men walking it in every season and every weather. He walked it now as the sky began to darken, the flat gray of the overcast deepening toward the gray of early evening. A light came on in one of the houses at the far end of the row, a kerosene lamp, its yellow light small and particular in the gray air. He reached number 7 and went up the 3 porch steps and opened the door. Inside, it was cold and dark. He lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table and then opened the stove and put in 3 pieces of coal from the bucket by the door. He had enough coal for perhaps 2 more weeks, after which he would have to buy it or move, and crumpled some newspaper and lit it and watched it catch. He stood over the stove for a moment with his hands held near it, not touching. He sat at the kitchen table while the stove ticked and began to warm. He had his coat on still. He put his bucket on the table and reached into his coat pocket and took out the piece of coal and set it on the table beside the bucket. It sat in the lamplight, black and slightly shining, the freshly broken face still bright where the oxidation had not yet reached. He looked at it for a while. Then he got up and went to the counter and made himself a cup of coffee, plain and without chicory, and brought it back to the table and sat with both hands around the cup and felt the warmth come up through his palms. The stove was beginning to heat the kitchen. Outside the window, the hills had gone dark, and the sky had gone the deep gray of early dark, and a few stars were showing at the upper edge of the window where the clouds had thinned. He thought about the $53 behind the floorboard. He thought about his brother in Ohio and the rubber plant in Akron. He thought about Roy in Cincinnati. He thought about none of these things with any urgency, not tonight. They were facts. The way the hills outside were a fact. The way the piece of coal on the table was a fact. They were the next things. But tonight was not yet the next things. He drank the coffee slowly. The stove ticked. The lamp burned. Outside, the mine was dark and locked, and the pump was still running, the last sound it would make, counting down toward the moment tomorrow when someone would come and shut it off, and the water would begin to rise. In 2 weeks, a month, the lower entries would be full. In a year, the water would be at the shaft collar. In 10 years, 20, the surface above the worked-out sections would settle and sag, the way the surface always did over old mines, and the hollow would change its shape slightly, very slightly, in ways that only someone who had known it well would notice. He sat at the table with his coffee and the piece of coal and the yellow light of the kerosene lamp, and he did not think about what came next. Not yet, not tonight. Tonight was the last day. Tomorrow was the first day of whatever came after, and he would figure it out then, the way he had figured out every other thing that had come to him, steadily, without hurrying, one piece at a time. He sat for a long time. When the coffee was gone and the stove had built to a good heat, he rinsed the cup and set it on the shelf and went to bed. He did not set the alarm. The clock ticked on the nightstand, the same as it always had. Outside, the hollow was quiet and dark and cold, and the mine was locked, and the stars above the ridgeline were sharp and numerous and utterly indifferent, the way they always were, the way they had been long before the mine and would be long after it, long after everything that had happened here had passed out of any memory at all. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.